I must say it's a real delight to be here. I was flattered to be asked to be here by Manulife Financial. It's such a great organization. I have a long history with the organization, and I was really delighted when I was in touch with Stephanie and heard about this organization. And it's really quite nice to be here with fellow entrepreneurs, people who understand the challenges and the joys of being an entrepreneur in this country. So I want to, at the outset, thank Manulife for having me here. Mr. Gordon, your presentation on numbers was very impressive, and I really enjoyed that. Enjoyed my company at the table this evening, and look forward to our evening together. It's always nice to be back in Toronto. I now live in Ottawa, and so getting back here is an additional benefit to me. I'd like to tell you that about 32 years ago, I lived in Toronto, but the circumstance was significantly different. I lived about 8 or 9 blocks from here, corner of Shooter and Jarvis. I was 26 years old, and I lived on Skid Row. The day of my life went something like this. There were 2 guys I was sharing a flop house with, and the 3 of us would go over to Yonge Street and we would panhandle nickels and dimes. And in 1970, early 1970s, there was wine stores in this city. And for 99 cents, you'd get a bottle of wine. And the 3 of us would go back to the alleyway, and we would take that bottle of wine and we would share it. And I can remember as if it were yesterday. The conversation went something like this. Tomorrow I'll get a job. Tomorrow I'll sober up. Tomorrow I'll be the best salesman there ever was. Tomorrow I'll be in touch with my family. Tomorrow. And tomorrow didn't come. And the day we wear on and we go back to Yonge Street, get some more wine. And then as the night was falling and it was getting late at night, we had a difficult choice to make. The choice was to sleep on the park bench or go back to Yonge Street and get 50 cents each so we could sleep in the flop house. If it was warm, we slept on the bench. Didn't start out like that. And life changed. And what happened? Well, on looking back on it, I couldn't tell you then what changed, but looking back on it, I can tell you what changed. The fundamental belief system that I had grown up with, that clicked in finally after many years of spending worse and worse times, the fundamental belief and the fundamental value of hope. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that hope is the beginning of all things, because without hope, I wouldn't do anything. I wouldn't have the courage to dream, the courage to imagine, the persistence to stay with the dream, the persistence to carry on when all things seem bleak. Without hope for a change in my life, a change in my community, a change in the world, I wouldn't be able to do any of that. I have a story about hope that I kind of like. It's a story about George. It's the 1930s. It's New York. It's the Bowery, and George is having a very difficult time. In fact, it was so difficult, it was 2 days since he had eaten anything. And as night was falling, he was becoming desperate when a guy came along and said to George, he heard about a job that George might be able to do. And apparently there was a house of ill repute around the corner, and they were looking for a bookkeeper. So the next morning, George went and rapped on the door, and the madam came to the door, and he said, I understand you're looking for a bookkeeper. And she said, yes, we are. What are your qualifications? And George says, I don't even have any qualifications. I can't even read or write. But I haven't eaten in 2.5 days, and I'm really hungry, and I thought if you had a job for a bookkeeper, maybe there was something else I could do just to earn enough money to get a meal. And the madam was just about to close the door. I said, just a minute. She went back into the kitchen. She came out. She gave George an apple. She said, I don't have a job, but at least here's something to eat. George went to the corner of the street and was just about to take a bite out of the apple when a guy in a suit went by. He said, I'll give you a dime for that apple. Now, in the 30s, a dime was a lot of money. He looked at the dime and he looked at the apple. He was hungry, but a dime was a lot of money, so he made the exchange. Got about halfway down the block, he saw a sign in the store, 2 apples for a dime. Now, he's an entrepreneur. He went back to the corner. Yeah. And after I was back and forth between the corner and the store and the corner and the store, and he was selling apples, and then he had a little stand on the corner, he was selling apples. And after a while, he had a store on the corner selling apples. Then he had another store selling apples, and he then franchised, and he had stores all across the country. And he moved to L.A., and he had apple orchards, and he was exporting apples all over the country, and he had a big office on top of one of those big buildings in L.A., and he was sitting with his feet up one day after his executive committee meeting, and he was thinking about his story. He said, somebody ought to tell this story. Somebody ought to write this book. So he lived in L.A. He picked up the phone, called a famous author, and he brought him in, and he told him the story, and the writer said, geez, you tell that so well. Why don't you write your own book? George said, you don't understand. I don't read or write. You don't read or write. He said, imagine if you had gone to high school, college, university, what might have become of you? He said, yeah, I'd be a bookkeeper in a whorehouse. With respect to all the accountants in the crowd. Well, we all have our stories. I told you mine. I got to Skid Row. It didn't start out that way. I grew up in Montreal West, a little town in Montreal, and sort of an English enclave, and somebody had looked at me 11, 12 years old, they would have said, hey, he's going to be like his dad, you know, a manager of a business, grow up, have kids, you know, all that sort of stuff. But I discovered alcohol when I was 13 years old. Didn't know I was going to have a problem with it. I didn't have any idea of that. I just discovered it. And I just never turned down a drink from then on, and I really developed a problem. And the first thing to go was university. I went to University of South Dakota, and around Christmas time, the dean called me in and suggested that perhaps I could find another university that would like to have my money. So I phoned my dad and got airfare to come home, and I arrived on a bus because I spent all the money on booze, and one thing led to another, and then finally one Sunday afternoon, my dad sat me down in the den of our home in Montreal West and said, Frank, for the good of the family, you have to leave. Your two brothers and a sister, they don't want to bring their friends home anymore because they don't know what shape you're going to be in. You just wrecked another one of my cars. I'm tired of the police showing up here every 6 or 8 weeks for some misdemeanor or other. I'm tired of hiring lawyers. I'm tired of showing up in court. Your mother's tired of cleaning up your bounced checks on Westminster Avenue. I've organized for you to have a job. You start tomorrow, you leave today, and you start a job tomorrow in Toronto. It's a sales job, and you're not to call your family or be in touch with any member of the family until you've done whatever you need to do about your problem. And off I went. And I came here to Toronto, and I was a salesman. I was selling paint. Southwestern Ontario was my territory, and I drove my car all over Southwestern Ontario, and I sold paint. And for the first 3 or 4 months, I was doing fine, but then alcohol, and then before long, I lost that job, and good jobs became lesser jobs, became lesser jobs, became lesser jobs, apartments became flophouse. Last guy I worked for was a guy named Izzy Wagner, or worked for is a euphemistic term. There was a guy that owned a paint store at the corner of College and Spadina. It's still there. It's called Exclusive Paints. Now, those of you who know Toronto, College and Spadina, the only thing exclusive about that store was the sign. But I met Izzy, and he liked me, and he told me that if I showed up for work, and if I worked for an hour or worked for the day, he would pay me $5. He later told me the reason he would only pay me $5 was because he felt I wouldn't hurt myself too badly with $5. If I worked through lunch, he would buy me lunch. My job was to take paint cans up out of the cellar of that store and put them on shelves, and I'm sure somebody had to come along and reorganize those after I left. The reason I tell that story was there's a commercial playing on CKEY in those days, and he always listened to CKEY. And I don't remember what the commercial was about, but the tagline said, if you have a problem with alcohol, call this number. You'd think that would have resonated with me. And I guess it did, but it didn't right away. Because it was many months later when I stood at Shooter and Jarvis, waiting for my other two friends to come out of that flop house to go and spend another day panhandling, when I finally had enough. Well, I didn't have enough of sleeping in flop houses or spending the odd night in jail or detox centers or being scooped up by the cops for one thing or another. That isn't what I'd